my bondage and my freedom. If at, no wait, Sunday was my only leisure time, I spent this in sort of a beast-like stupor between sleep and wake, under some large tree. At times I would rise up, a flash of energetic freedom would dart through my soul, accompanied with a faint beam of hope, flickered for a moment and then vanished. I sank down again, mourning over my wretched condition. I was sometimes prompted to take my life and that of Mr. Edward Covey's, but was prevented by a combination of hope and fear. My sufferings on this plantation seemed now like a dream rather than a stern reality. Our house stood within a few rods of the Chesapeake Bay, whose broad bosom was ever white with sails from every quarter of the habitable globe. Those beautiful vessels, robed in purest white, so delightful to the eye of freemen, were me so many shrouded ghosts to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. I've often, in the deep stillness of a summer's Sabbath, stood all alone upon the banks of that noble bay and traced with saddened heart and tearful eye the countless number of sails moving off to the mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there, with no audience but the Almighty, I would pour out my soul's complaint in my rude way with an apostrophe to the moving multitude of ships. You are loosed from your moorings and free, and I'm fast in my chains, and I'm a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly around the world, and I'm confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free! Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wing! Alas, betwixt me and you the turbid waters roll. Go on, oh, that I could also go. Could I but swim, if I could fly, oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is gone, she hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Oh, God save me, God deliver me, let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave? I'll run away, I will not stand to get caught or get clear. I'll try it. I might as well die with ague as with fever. I only have one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing. Only think of it, 100 miles straight north and I'm free. Try it? Yes, God helping me, I will. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall yet bear me into freedom. The steamboat steered in the northeast coast from North Point. I will do the same, and when I get to the head of the bay, I will turn my canoe adrift and walk straight through Delaware into Pennsylvania. When I get there, I shall not be required to have a pass. I'll travel without being disturbed. Let but the first opportunity offer, and come what will, I am off. Meanwhile, I will try to bear up under the yoke. I'm not only a slave in the world. Why should I fret? I can bear as much as any of them. Besides, I'm but a boy, and all boys are bound to someone. Maybe that my misery and slavery will only increase my happiness when I get free. There's a better day coming. I shall never be able to narrate the mental experience through which it was my lot to pass through during my stay at Edward fucking Covey's. I was completely wrecked, changed and bewildered, goaded almost to madness at one time, and another reconciled myself to my wretched condition. Everything in the way of kindness which I had experienced at Baltimore, all my former hopes and aspirations for usefulness in the world, the happy moments spent in the exercises of religion, contrasted with my then present lot, but increased my anguish. I suffered bodily as well as mentally. I had neither sufficient time in which to eat or to sleep except on Sundays. The overwork and the brutal chastisements of which I was the victim, combined with that ever-gnawing and soul-devouring thought, I am a slave for life, a slave with no rational ground to hope for freedom, rendered me a living embodiment of mental and physical wretchedness. Chapter 16, Another Pressure of the Tyrant's Vice. The foregoing chapter, with all its horrid incidents and shocking features, may be taken as a fair representation of the first 6 months of my life at Edward Covey's. The reader has but to repeat in his own mind once a week the scene in the woods where Edward Covey subjected me to his merciless lash to have a true idea of my bitter experience there during the first period of the breaking process through which Edward fucking Covey carried me. I have no heart to repeat each separate transaction in which I was a victim of his violence and brutality. Such a narration would fill a volume much larger than the present one. I aim only to give the reader a truthful impression of my slave life without unnecessarily affecting him with harrowing details. As I have elsewhere intimated that my hardships were much greater during the first 6 months of my stay at Edward fucking Covey's than during the remainder of the year, and as the change in my condition was owing to causes which may help the reader to better understanding of human nature when subjected to the terrible extremities of slavery, I will narrate the circumstances of this change, although I may seem thereby to applaud my own courage. You have, dear reader, seen me humbled, degraded, broken down, enslaved, and brutalized, and you understand how it was done. Now let us see the converse of all this, and how it was brought about, and this will take us through the year 1834. On one of the hottest days of the month of August, on the year just mentioned, had the reader been passing through Edward fucking Covey's farm, he might have seen me at work in what is there called the treading yard, a yard upon which wheat is trotted out from the straw by the horse's feet. I was there at work feeding the fan, or rather bringing wheat to the fan while Bill Smith was feeding. Our force consisted of Bill Hughes, Bill Smith, and a slave by the name of Eli. The latter had been hired for this occasion. The work was simple and required strength and activity rather than any skill or intelligence, and yet to one entirely unused to such work it came very hard. The heat was intense and overpowering, and there was much hurry to get the wheat trodden out that day through the fan. Since that work was done an hour before sundown, the hands would have, according to a promise of Edward fucking Covey, that hour added to their night's rest. I was not behind any of them in the wish to complete the day's work before sundown, and hence I struggled with all my might to get the work forward. The promise of 1 hour's repose on a weekday was sufficient to quicken my pace and to spur me on to extra endeavor. Besides, we had all planned to go fishing, and I certainly wished to have a hand in that, but I was disappointed, and the day turned out to be one of the bitterest I ever experienced. About 3 o'clock, while the sun was pouring down his burning rays, and not a breeze was stirring, I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness and trembling in every limb. Finding what was coming and feeling it would never do to stop work, I nerved myself up and staggered on until I fell by the side of the wheat fan, feeling that the earth had fallen upon me. This brought the entire work to a dead stand. There was work for four. Each had his part to perform, and each part depended on the other, so that when one stopped, all were compelled to stop. Edward Covey, who had now become my dread as well as my tormentor, was at the house about 100 yards from where I was fanning, and instantly upon hearing the fan stop, he came down to the treading yard to inquire into the cause of our stopping. Bill Smith told him I was sick, and I was unable longer to bring wheat to the fan. I had by this time crawled away under the side of the post and rail fence in the shade, and I was exceedingly ill. The intense heat of the sun, the heavy dust rising from the fan, the stooping to take up the wheat from the yard, together with the hurrying to get through, had caused a rush of blood to my head. In this condition, Edward fucking Covey, finding out where I was, came to me. And after standing over me a while, he asked me what the matter was. And I told him as well as I could, for it was with difficulty that I could speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side, which jarred my whole frame and commanded me to get up. The man had obtained complete control over me, and if he had commanded me to do any possible thing, I should. In my then state of might, having endeavored to comply, I made an effort to rise, but fell back in the attempt before gaining my feet. The brute now gave me another heavy kick and told me again to rise. I again tried to rise and succeeded in gaining my feet, but upon stooping to get the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell to the ground. And I must have so fallen had I been sure that 100 bullets would have pierced me as the consequence. While down in this sad condition and perfectly helpless, the merciless Negro breaker took up the hickory slab with which Hughes had been striking off the wheat to a level with the size of the half-bushel measure, a very hard weapon. And with the sharp edge of it, he dealt me a heavy blow on my head, which made a large gash and caused the blood to run freely, saying at the same time, "If you have a headache, I'll cure you." This done, he ordered me again to rise, but I made no effort to do so, for I had made up my mind that it was useless and that the heartless monster might now do his worst. He could but kill me, and that might put me out of my misery. Finding me unable to rise, or rather despairing of my doing so, Edward fucking Covey left me, and with a view to getting on with the work without me. I was bleeding very freely, and my face was soon covered with my warm blood. Cruel and merciless as was the motive that dealt the blow, dear reader, the wound was fortunate for me. Bleeding was never more efficacious. The pain in my head speedily abated, and I was soon able to rise. Edward Covey had, as I have said, now left me to my fate, and the question was, shall I return to my work, or shall I find my way to St. Michael's and make Captain Auld acquainted with the atrocious cruelty of his brother Edward fucking Covey, and beseech him to get me another master, remembering the object he had in view and placing me under the management of Edward fucking Covey, and further his cruel treatment of my poor crippled cousin Henny, his meanness in the matter of feeding and clothing the slaves. There was little ground to hope for a favorable reception at the hands of Captain Thomas Auld. Nevertheless, I resolved to go straight to Captain Thomas Auld, thinking that if not animated by motives of humanity, he might be induced to interfere on my behalf from selfish considerations. He cannot, thought I, allow his property to be thus bruised and battered, marred and defaced, and I'll go to him, tell him the simple truth about the matter. In order to get to St. Michael's by the most favorable and direct road, I must walk 7 miles, and this, in my sad condition, was no easy performance. I had already lost much blood. I was exhausted by overexertion. My sides were sore from the heavy blows planted there by the stout boots of Mr. Edward fucking Covey, and I was, in every way, in an unfavorable plight for the journey. I, however, watched my chance while the cruel and cunning Mr. Edward fucking Covey was looking in an opposite direction and started off across the fields for St. Michael's. This was a daring step. If it failed, it would only exasperate Edward fucking Covey and increase the rigors of my bondage during the remainder of my term of service under him. But the step was taken, and I must go forward. I succeeded in getting nearly halfway across the broad field toward the woods before Mr. fucking Edward Covey observed me. I was still bleeding, and the exertion of running had started the blood afresh. Come back! Come back! Vociferated Edward fucking Covey, with threats of what he would do if I did not return instantly. But disregarding his calls and his threats, I pressed on toward the woods as fast as my feeble state would allow. Seeing no signs of my stopping, Edward fucking Covey caused his horse to be brought out and saddled as if he intended to pursue me. The race was now to be an unequal one, and thinking I might be overhauled by him if I kept the main road, I walked nearly the whole distance in the woods, keeping far enough from the road to avoid detection and pursuit. But I had not gone far before my little strength again failed me, and I laid down. The blood was still oozing from my wound in my head, and for a time I suffered more than I could describe. There I was in the deep woods, sick and emaciated, pursued by a wretch whose character for revolting cruelty beggars all opprobrious speech, bleeding and almost bloodless. I was not without the fear of bleeding to death. The thought of dying in the woods all alone, of being torn to pieces by the buzzards, had not yet rendered tolerable by my many troubles and hardships, and I was glad when the shade of the tree and the cool evening breeze combined with my matted hair to stop the flow of blood. After lying there about 3/4 of an hour, brooding over the singular and mournful lot to which I was doomed, my mind passing over the whole scale or circle of belief and unbelief, from faith in the overruling providence of God to the blackest atheism, I again took up my journey toward St. Michael's, more weary and sad than in the morning when I left Thomas Auld's for the home of Mr. Covey. I was barefooted and bald-headed. Blackest atheism, that's an interesting term, using black in a bad way for atheism. Faith in the God. I again took up my journey to St. Michael's, more weary and sad than in the morning when I left Thomas Auld's for the home of Mr. Covey. I was barefooted and bareheaded, and in my shirt sleeves the way was through bogs and briars, and I tore my feet often during the journey. I was full 5 hours in going the 7 or 8 miles, partly because of the difficulties of the way and partly because of the feebleness induced by my illness, bruises, and loss of blood. On gaining my master's store, I presented an appearance of wretchedness and woe, fitted to move any but a heart of stone. From the crown of my head to the sole of my feet there were marks of blood. My hair was all clotted with dust and blood, and the back of my shirt was literally stiff with the same. Briars and thorns had scarred and torn my feet and legs, leaving blood marks there. I had escaped from a den of tigers. I could not have looked worse than I did on reaching St. Michael's. In this unhappy plight I appeared before my professedly Christian master, humbly to invoke the interposition of his power and authority to protect me from further abuse and violence. I had begun to hope, during the latter part of my tedious journey towards St. Michael's, that Captain Thomas Auld would now show himself in nobler light than I had ever before seen him. I was disappointed. I had jumped from a sinking ship into the sea. I had fled from the tiger to something worse. I told him all the circumstances as well as I could, how I was endeavoring to please Edward Covey, how hard I was at work in the present instance, how unwilling I sunk down under the heat, toil, and pain, the brutal manner in which Edward Covey had kicked me in the side, the gas cut in my head, my hesitation about troubling him, kept on all the complaints, but that now I felt it would best be no longer to conceal from him the outrages committed on me from time to time by Mr. Edward fucking Covey.